Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today I want to finally have another video here. We've been kind of dead on the channel, not a lot going on. It's the off season, right? And we're past free agency, we're past the draft. We kind of know everything, and we're just, doing off season activities at this point, which not a ton to report. But I think it's fair to say right now, we know where the roster is. It's probably not going to be many more moves. So there are very clear questions going into this next year, and I want to talk about them. I've got 7 things to bring up today. So we're going to ask some of these big questions that I think will define this season, because while the Jaguars, I think, have improved as a team this offseason, I think it's kind of hard to argue against that unless you really just kind of put all the new additions at their lowest possible level of impact. I do think there's still some questions, right? Because last year ended very poorly. There were problems with physicality in the trenches. They couldn't really run the ball well. Trevor Lawrence was getting hurt every week. Defense was crumbling, right? A lot of different things, and they've done a lot to address it. But I want to ask these questions and then also get your guys' opinions on them. I plan to put up polls on Twitter for all these you can respond to, because I'm curious kind of where the fans lie. But I am going to give my opinions on these in this video, and what I think could really shape the 2024 season, which right now has a wide variety of outcomes. I think this team has the potential to be a deep playoff contender. I also think they have the potential to disappoint and miss the playoffs because of some big potential Achilles heels on this team, and multiple of them, that is. So with that all said, let's go ahead and let's jump into this. So first thing I want to mention is a question regarding the physicality of the offensive line. And so the one big addition this offseason was Mitch Morse. That is the only starter that has changed on the offensive line. At the end of the season, there was a big issue with the Jaguars being dominated in the trenches. They were not a super physical team. Luke Fortner was really, I think, the big Achilles heel of that offensive line. And it ended up kind of being their downfall, because they played a lot of strong teams in the trenches at the end of the year, playing the AFC North, teams like the Bengals, the Browns, the Ravens, all teams with really good defensive lines, throwing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and even the Tennessee Titans at the end of the year, who got guys like Jeffrey Simmons. So it really exposed this team late in the season. And the Jaguars went out and they made a big addition, I think, especially when you're talking about physicality, in Mitch Morse. My opinion on this, I think that Mitch Morse is at least an average center. I think he is a probably good pass blocker still, assuming age and change of scenery doesn't lead to him playing worse. And as a run blocker, he's been usually about average, potentially below average. Now, we'll have to see if there's regression at this point in his career. But one of the things that really stood out with Mitch Morse that I liked was that he was a physical player. He was someone who's not afraid to put guys into the dirt. And I think that's something that the Jaguars have been missing. I think that is going to help a lot on this offensive line, but this is going to be one of the big questions, because I think just watching this team throughout the last couple seasons, this is one of the areas they've really been missing. It's been the physicality. It's also been the run blocking, but the physicality has been really poor. I think it sets the tone for the team. And I think the Mitch Morse addition has the potential to change that. But as far as maybe some of the other aspects, might be a little limited, because you're talking about an older player. But I do think you've got some physical players here. You've got Mitch Morse. Cam Robinson is the one guy who's really stood out a lot. He'll be returning hopefully for the full season. Last year, ended up missing games because of suspension for trying to get back from injury quicker, it would appear, and then ended up getting hurt again. And so I think if you have these two guys, that is really going to help out with the physicality. I think you're kind of just generally going to lack that from maybe Brandon Scherf. Ezra Cleveland as well is a player that, while I was a huge fan of that move, I think he's a phenomenal run blocker when he's on his game, he has had a problem with not being a super physical guy. This is a team that has been built primarily with athletic offensive linemen, people who can get on the move, do well at the second level, and do all those crazy things you're going to ask of that group of guys. So I do think this will be improved. where I have my issue, I think, with the offensive line's physicality is I do not think it is necessarily a plus. I think they've gone from being a below average and well below average offensive line when it comes to their physical presence to being maybe at most average. Because you still got a little bit of questions with, Anton Harrison as well. I think you saw a little bit of it his first year, but I think it's something where he's just going to have to improve his confidence. He's going to do that. He's gotten better throughout his first year. He'll be even better his second year, hopefully. And so this offensive line should take a step forward, but I do have my concerns about how physical they're going to be. How are you going to perform against these deep playoff contenders like the Kansas City Chiefs, like teams such as the Baltimore Ravens? The Cincinnati Bengals have done more to ramp up their defensive line as well, although they, of course, lost DJ Reader, who, to be fair, has been injured a lot. So got to factor that in too. But I thought this was an area where it was a big question going into the offseason. They've done something to fix it, but it also feels like at the same time kind of the least that they could do, right? I mean, technically you could keep Luke Fortner as a starter. I just don't think that was ever an option. So that's kind of where I stand on that, but I'd love to hear what you guys think as far as that part of the team. And I think this is also a unit that going into the future is going to have a lot of changes. After this offseason, you've got Cam Robinson, final year of his contract. Brandon Scherf, final year of his contract. Mitch Morse will have one more year on his contract, but there's only a small portion of that guaranteed. So if he has a poor season, might be looking at 3 new starters on this offensive line potentially, and it being a very heavy focus maybe in the NFL draft or free agency and that sort of stuff. So still talking about the offensive line here, we'll kind of move into my second big question for the 2024 Jacksonville Jaguars. And this is the question we've had for a while. One of the first things I ever mentioned on this channel when I started recording videos. Have the Jaguars done enough to help Travis Etienne? I believe that Travis Etienne is an elite running back. And I think that the way the team has been built up to this point, whether or not that has changed, has not been good enough for him. I think that the interior run blocking has been very poor. I've even, in fact, gone on Twitter and mentioned that, talking about the role of Tank Bigsby, and he went on my page and liked the dang post. So it would appear some people in the building who also run the football would agree with that. And so I think that's been an issue. I think that in general, the team is focused very heavily on pass blockers. They have taken on guys that as run blockers have not been that great because it is a secondary thing towards them. This team, I think if it has an identity, which we'll talk about here in a minute as well, was to throw the football. It is to be a pass-heavy offense. And to me, I have wanted this team for quite a while to be a little more balanced and to focus on the run game too, because I think that's been lacking, at least as far as what the potential could be. And I think they have a special player in their backfield that they need to take advantage of, especially while he's on a rookie contract, while he's young, considering these players don't have that long of careers. So that's kind of where I've stood before this. I do think this offseason that the Jaguars have done more to help Travis Etienne. You look at the offensive line, right? We talked about Mitch Morse a bunch here for the last point. Well, Mitch Morse has been an average to below average run blocker throughout his career, although he has been physical, and that's something you like to see. That is still far and above better than what Luke Fortner has offered so far. As we know, Fortner has been very below average in most facets of his game, other than pass blocking, where I'd say he comes in nearly average. I think that's where his strength is. And that kind of goes along the lines of the Jaguars often targeting these players that are built athletically and that are built primarily to pass block. They're not built to go maul. They're not built to go, destroy defenders. They don't really get that kind of movement because they just don't have the power a lot of the time for it. But Mitch Morse, given, he is at least close to average as a run blocker and he brings that physical element, I think that will help a lot with the interior run blocking. I also think as well that you look at the wide receiver room and you brought in some players who I think can be good blockers, right? Gabe Davis, to this point, from what I'm aware of, has been a very good run blocker. Brian Thomas Jr. is maybe a little more questionable for me because, well, he is a big guy, right? He's a 6'2", 209-pound receiver. One of the biggest elements that he has been missing, and we talked about this when we were doing our live stream, which unfortunately got partially taken down because of SEC content, but physicality is what has been lacking in his game. And so as a run blocker, I think he's been all right, but I think there is some room to improve. But compared to what the teams had before, I think the Jaguars have done more to help ETN than they have in all of his previous years starting. Unfortunately, I don't know if that's enough help, because I still look at the interior of this offensive line. I see one player that's an above average run blocker, and I think can be a very good one this year. That's Ezra Cleveland. I look at the center. I see a guy who's probably going to be about average. And I look at Brandon Scherf, and I see a player that, while he's still a good pass protector, the run blocking is not the same. He is not, right now, a good run blocker. And I would go out and say that maybe he ends up being a below average run blocker. I look at the tackles as well. I think, at most, not really great run blockers. I think Anton Harrison could prove to be more there. He's going into his second year, of course. But Cam Robinson is graded out pretty average in that facet, has not been dominant there. So I have questions. I do think that if Brennan Strange can get out on the field more and be maybe more of a receiving threat and be more reliable in a bigger role, you could use him as part of your run blocking unit, because I think he could be good at that. I think that was one of his strengths coming out of college. So I think the team has done more, but I also think they've passed up some opportunities to improve in this way. And you look at really the last 2 years, especially with the draft, because this offensive line, for the most part, has cost a lot of money. There's been a lot of players earning top dollar at their position, and unfortunately, they have not played up to that level. You look at Cam Robinson, who has been a good pass protector, but an average run blocker, and he's earning a lot of money. And the difference between, the lower end starting guys, or we'll say the average starters, right? Because I think Cam Robinson's about there, maybe a little above average, going up to the very best. The difference in the cost is not enough to where I want to be a team paying a guy who is going to be just slightly above average. And then also not available right now. Brandon Scherf, in addition, I think has been fine, but he gets paid a lot of money, and he is an older prospect. He's an older player, I should say. And I think each year you're going to see him continue to get worse, just because that's naturally how things go. In the last 2 years, the Jaguars have passed up on some pretty obvious opportunities to plan for the future there. Now, sure, they've made some picks, right? Anton Harrison was one of them. I commend that pick. It was a great selection. You also look at the tackle they brought in this year in Javon Foster. I think Foster's a backup, but he is actually a pretty solid run blocker. And so, I look at that, and that's something, but you also consider the 2023 NFL Draft. Passing on Osiris Torrance to trade down and to pick Brendan Strange, who had no role to be a starter, no path there, that is, and really hasn't done anything to this point. Given he's going into his second year, the verdict's not out yet, but there's questions about that pick. You passed on Osiris Torrance for that. When you had a need at guard, you didn't have a left guard at that point. And I think Torrance could have moved over there just fine. You also consider this last year. You had a couple opportunities to make a trade. And I know you got to obviously get the deal done with another team, but the Jaguars have had plenty of capital to do that. They've just had an inability to work with other teams because they're always searching for the opportunity to get the complete victory, to get the trade that has no risk involved. You look at all the trades they've done. It's just historically what they've done with Trent Baalke. But you had Jackson Powers Johnson fall into the second round. And, well, you have a center. Jackson Powers Johnson could start at guard. I think he did fine at that when he was asked to. He did well in 2022 when he played guard. He did well at the Senior Bowl when he was put in those positions. I think he's primarily a center, but JPJ was going to be a very clear top-end starter in the NFL. He fell into the second, and the Jaguars didn't make him move because they had predetermined a pick. You also look at the third, where guys like Christian Haynes, who fell down the board. Jaguars didn't make a move again. Now, I like the Jerrion Jones pick. I'm not saying all these picks are terrible, right? The point is that I think with this offensive line, they've neglected some opportunities to make an upgrade. I'm not saying they have to do every single thing I want them to do, right? That's unrealistic. But I think when you have opportunities available to you and you pass on them consistently, it's going to put this team in a bad situation. I am not completely confident in the run game. I think it has improved. I do not think it is yet good enough. And you also consider the fact that past this season, which this isn't really the point of this video, but going into 2025, got all these players you don't know the future of. You don't know if they're going to start. You don't know if they're going to be on the team. His contracts are ending. Guarantees are ending. And this could look very different. And they could be wishing that they had made some moves there. So over the last couple of years, I'd say they haven't done near enough. But I would say it's gotten better this offseason. Now, we've talked a lot about the offensive line, for about 15 minutes here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about some other areas on this team too, because it's more in the offensive line. As much as I care about that, as much as that for me would be an emphasis as a team and where I'd really start with things other than your quarterback, we are going to talk about some other topics. The one I think that's very prevalent right now to a lot of fans is really the edge rusher position. And what is the plan if an injury takes place? You never know what's going to happen, right? And most likely, Josh Allen, and throw in Trayvon Walker as well, your other starter there and someone who took a big step last year, most likely they'll be healthy the whole season, right? But I have questions about whether or not their backups are going to be able to take that step forward and get on the field and play well on the field. For Travis Gibson, for example, while he's shown some incredible play during the preseason, there is a reason why he has not been on the field during the regular season. He has not been able to earn that role. And so I have questions about whether, if there is an injury, that he can go out and he can play full time, because I think right now he's probably your third guy. You also look at your Yasir Abdullah, who he had really good moments in college. I think if it wasn't for size, he would have been an earlier pick. But he is undersized for the NFL, and there are major questions with how he can do with a lot of snaps. The point is right now that I think the room behind these guys is not in a good situation. Now, could you move guys out to defensive end in your 4-3 scheme? Can you have Roy Robertson Harris play a lot of snaps there? Yeah, you could. Could you have Eric Armstead kick out to defensive end a bit? You can do that as well. That still is not a good situation, because those are not necessarily guys that you want in that position and in that position a lot. And so I think this is probably, out of everything, potentially the biggest question for just this year. Now, there's bigger questions long term we'll get into. We'll talk a little bit about Trevor Lawrence at the end of this. But this is, I think, the one really big Achilles heel for this team, and probably the most impactful thing that could go wrong. Because if one of these players goes down, I think it changes things. I think you double team someone. I think if it's Trayvon Walker who's still out there, I think he'll struggle trying to be the number one guy. I don't think he's that yet. We'll see, of course. It's another year to take a step forward. But it does a lot for these guys to be on the field at the same time, because it allows them to not constantly be double teamed, to not constantly be the guy that they're barreling down on. So I think right now, if we're talking about a position that could change before the season, maybe a position they add to, I think it's probably edge rusher. If I was the Jaguars right now, if I was the GM, if I was Trent Baalke, I would be looking for a guy to add to this room. And I mean a legit player, because I think, for one, you need a rotation. Can't have these guys out there 100% of the time, because, for one, they're not going to be as good if they're playing 100% of the time. And two, you're going to get them hurt doing that. It's too much time on the field. So, you look at guys who might be available. I don't know if Hassan Reddick, for example, has been extended. I think he's still a potential trade candidate. You look at Trey Hendrickson. The Jaguars have a lot of money right now. And for the way they've gone, well, I disagree with going all in right now, because I don't personally think right now this is a team that could win the Super Bowl this year. Technically, anything can happen. It's just not my opinion that they're going to go that far or really come super close. If they've decided to go all in, which they've spent a lot of money this offseason and made a lot of investments in that way, they pushed a lot of cap down the road, it's very much a team building for now. I would be looking at a player to add. And I think if they don't do that, that is a disservice to the way that they're planning out this team. So I think that's something they need to consider. They have a lot of draft picks this next year. You got an extra third, an extra fourth, and I think even an extra fifth, maybe? No, actually, I think just third and fourth. With that, I think that's enough to get a trade done and still have adequate draft capital. And it's Minnesota picks, by the way, the extra picks. Those are going to be valuable. That's a team that's probably going to have to sit their rookie quarterback, probably not going to have a great year. There is value in those selections that they've added. They have room to move picks. They have room to add a player who costs a bit. That is something I would definitely be looking at. So I think this is an area where it is a big question for me. And I think, obviously, like, you can't predict whether an injury happens or not. But if it does, I think this is the kind of injury that could derail a team. Almost as much as a quarterback can. Not that same level, but close. Because Josh Allen is a very important player for this team. And as much as you don't want to plan for an injury, as much as you don't want that to happen, you have to be ready for everything you can be ready for. So this is an area I think the Jaguars do need to improve. I think it's a big question. I don't think it has a legitimate answer. I think to have that question answered with the group right now, you need a lot of projection. And I mean a lot of projection, because you got guys that have not clearly proven that they can go out and handle a big workload at defensive end. Now, next thing to talk about, getting to identity. We mentioned this earlier in the video, but the last couple of years, I think with the Jaguars, there's been a lack of an identity. I think the closest you got, which really isn't exactly how I would define it, was in 2022 of this being a resilient team, this being a team that could overcome really anything. You were going to get a team that, even if they were down 27 in the playoffs in the second quarter, they were still going to find a way to win that game. What I mean, though, when we're talking about identity, is to have a way you want to play the game and to be successful at that. And last year, with what the Jaguars did, it just wasn't a clear plan for this team. You look at Trevor Lawrence and what he was doing on the field. He's throwing often short passes, not getting a lot of yardage. They don't have much of a vertical game. They had some plays, but a lot of them were drops. A lot of them were missed opportunities. You had issues with communication with Calvin Ridley running wrong routes. It just wasn't consistent. Zay Jones being injured as well. And so last year, there really was not a clear plan for this team. When you thought of the Jacksonville Jaguars, you didn't immediately think, oh, this is a pass-heavy offense that wants to win vertically, or they want to have the big playability. That wasn't clear. Now, I do think this offseason, the Jaguars have done a much better job planning their team around an identity. And I think that identity going into 2024 is for this to be that pass-heavy offense that can have that big playability, that can change the course of a game in 10 seconds on the field. Just one big play. The guys like Brian Thomas Jr., guys like Gabe Davis, even Christian Kirk. We've seen him be able to do that. So I think they really want to focus on this vertical element, and I'm very happy for that, because when you go back to watching Trevor Lawrence in college, I think that's a lot of what they succeeded with at Clemson. That was a lot of what he did. This is a player that has a pretty big arm. Let's take advantage of it. Let's not throw 5 yards every single play. Let's actually throw the ball to the middle. I think the Jaguars failed last year to challenge defenses in a multitude of ways. I think they were very predictable. They were either going to get no gains running up the middle. They were going to throw the outside a few yards down. They weren't going to challenge you vertically. And that was it. Weren't going to establish their physical presence either. And so I think the Jaguars have done something to improve in this regard. I think that this is a team that's going to make a bit more sense and have a clearer image as to what they want to be. I think on defense as well that they've done more. I think when Ryan Nielsen came into this team and gave his first press conference on what he wanted it to be, I think he was very clear. I think that he wants this to be an aggressive football team. He wants this to be a physical football team. Want to be a man coverage team. I think they've built for that very well. And I think they have a coach who's going to be able to elevate these players. Someone who made it very clear as well that he wants to teach. He wants to be a teacher. They are going to be focused on developing prospects, which was something that was missing last year. Players didn't take big steps forward on this team for the most part. So I feel like what they've done this offseason has given us a clearer image of what they are supposed to be in the 2024 NFL season. And whether or not you agree with it, whether or not you think it's the best approach to what they could do, I think it's clear what they want to do. And so I think you look at what these players succeed with, the kind of talent they have, it makes sense to build this team this way. And there's a lot of potential for what they could be in 2024. Now, we got a couple more things to talk about here before we wrap this up. One of the biggest questions for me this offseason was, how are the Jaguars going to do in the draft? Was it going to be the same old, same old? Were they going to go out, reach on a bunch of picks, not get good value, not pick up players who are falling other than Antonio Johnson last year, who they still skipped on 4 or 5 times? Ended up working out great, right? Got him at the latest pick they probably could have, and he's been great for the team. But the question for me was, were the Jaguars going to actually draft better? Were they going to get players that were going to have an impact? And that's something that I think has to be proven differently this year. I think they have to have players who have a little more hope behind them by the end of week 18 or by the end of, whatever playoff game they end up playing. And when I looked at this draft class, I felt like compared to 2023, there was a little more potential in these players. You think about picks in the former draft, right? You look at Brendan Strange. What's the ceiling of that pick? It's him being a very good tight end too. He's not going to be your tight end 1. I mean, best case scenario, maybe at the end of his contract he is, but there's not a player I thought who was ever going to take on that role. So at most, maybe it's worth the pick. And I don't think it was ever going to be. You look at Tank Bigsby as well. If they were able to do everything they needed to do around him, to help him run the ball up the middle, to help him get short yardage, he'd be a solid pick. But as far as a third rounder, it's probably the ceiling for where he is if he plays really well, because he's still going to be your backup, right? There's not that RB1 potential there, unless you're just giving up on Travis Etienne, which would be a pretty poor decision. So you got a lot of picks like that. We're talking mainly about these first 2 days of the draft. You go into 2024, though, and I think it is a little bit different. While I was disappointed with some of the selections, especially at the time of the picks and with Mason Smith specifically, there is at least potential for Mason Smith to be worth more than the pick he was taken at. And I also think it's a much better situation. I think those players are being brought into very good rooms with very good coaches. You look at the other guys we just talked about from 2023, like look at Tank Bigsby, for example. I don't think he came into a good situation because they want him to be a short yardage guy behind an offensive line that's very weak on the interior in the run game. So he was never going to be that likely to succeed that first year. But you look at Mason Smith, he comes in with coaches he's worked with some of his teammates. He comes in a role where he's going to be a backup to start. He's going to be working with some very good players on the defensive line. It makes the most sense out of the 32 teams in the NFL for him to be in Jacksonville. And as far as his ceiling and what I think he could be, what I think he's in a very good position to be, is that he could be a very good pass rusher on the interior. And I think he could be good enough against the run defense where he can be on the field for those plays. And given the fact that these players rotate, that they're not always going to be full-time, especially your defensive tackles, take him off the field for some of the run plays, let him rest up them. That's a very high ceiling. That's a player that could be worth a first-round pick. You look at Jerrion Jones after that, your 3rd round pick. With him, I think that right now, he's a very good coverage corner. I think with his size, he's ideally built for inside. I think he would struggle a little bit playing on the boundary. As much as the boundary is more of a need, I still want to put these guys in the best position for them to succeed, and it is probably in the slot for Jones. The question for Jones, given that he's very good in coverage, given as well that his instincts are great as a player, it is really just tackling. And tackling is a big projection, right? That is a hard thing for a player to improve at, going from college to the NFL. The good news is that Jones has some time to improve that. He's got 4 years on a rookie contract. He's got Darnell Savage in front of him. I see him as a player that may not be super valuable the first few years, but I think he's that long-term starter at nickel, especially if he can fix those tackling issues. Because if he can do that, he's going to be really good in run defense. He knows where the ball is going. He's smart. He's going to make the big plays as long as he can finish those dang tackles. That is the entire problem with him. I think this is a good coach as well to be doing that with, because I think that's going to be an emphasis for Ryan Nielsen. So these picks, what I want to make clear is I think that the potential is much higher than it was in 2024. I also think, 2023. I also think that the floor is kind of low for some of these players. Mason Smith is the kind of guy that, if it doesn't work out, might not have much of a role in the NFL. Might be a Taven Bryan. You look at Jerrion Jones, it's a possibility that it's hard to start him because he might be a liability as a tackler. He might give up some big plays because he can't finish. So that's also a problem that might limit him to maybe only being a backup throughout his career. But there is the potential there. And I think that the key thing for these players, compared to last year, it's the potential being higher and the fact that I think they're in better positions too. And so we're obviously talking more about these earlier guys, right? Because those are your big picks. Those are the guys that this would apply to, because we're talking about who can be an impact that first year. Day 3 guys is a bit harder. I don't think Jordan Jefferson's going to be an impact player. I don't think Javon Foster will be, unless he starts and figures out a lot of things, because he is not a super refined player at this point. Think like your kicker, absolutely, like Cam Little could be great. Still a kicker, though. I think he'll be fine, though. I do like him. I love the pick. I think I gave it an A+, in fact. But I think this is going to be better. I think this draft class was an improvement. Was it the best they could have done? No, I wouldn't say that, right? And you can go watch my draft class breakdown on what I said about each player. Watch the videos on that. You can also watch the one where I talk about the whole class. I gave it a C+. But I do think that there's a lot of potential here, a lot of good fits, and I think this will be a question that could age very well, and maybe my initial reactions don't look that great. And I prefer that, right? Because I'd rather be wrong than be right and the players don't pan out like they should. Always going to feel that way. Now, moving into big questions, right? Long-term questions as well. One that's being talked about a lot right now, given that the contract extension is seemingly very close. It's about Trevor Lawrence. You know, people are talking about, has he earned this contract? Is it worth it to sign this contract right now? It will probably be signed before the year. But the question for me is whether or not Trevor Lawrence can silence the doubt this year. Because I think there very clearly is doubt about whether or not he's going to live up to the billing of being the first overall pick in that draft. Now, given the other quarterbacks weren't that good, yeah, he's the best quarterback in the class, whether or not he works out and is elite, right? And I think he will. That's where I lean right now. Not 100% though. I am not 100% sold that he's going to be an elite prospect, but I think he will be. I'm leaning that way. But Trevor Lawrence, every year of his career, there have been questions. I think the closest you come to not having them was 2022, where really it was just the first half of the year, and then he played great football after that. But you look at the first year, you got Urban Meyer, right? Terrible year for him, completely understand. And a common theme with all these seasons and all these games, that there's almost always an excuse. And not that they're a bad excuse. I'm not even saying that in a negative way, but there's a reason that you can give for why his play has been this way. At a point, Things have to change, though. At a point, he has to have a consistent season with great quarterback play. So far, just in my eyes, the way I see it, first year was bad. There's a reason for that, right? Second year started off poorly. They got things figured out. He played great at the end of the year, and he was arguably the best quarterback in the league. You can look at his statistics. You can look at the way he played on the field. He was right there with Patrick Mahomes, at minimum. Year 3, though, didn't do a ton early in the year. I think up through the San Francisco game, had 9 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. Now, given he probably has some rushing touchdowns too, and the stats aren't everything. But there were still just moments that you question what he was doing. It was clear that he was not playing at an elite level. I have a hard time saying he was early in the season. Now, you did see the games where he got better, right? The Tennessee game was a clear example of that. Had a phenomenal game against them at home, beat Houston on the road. Should have been a blowout if it wasn't for a crazy call with an interception that was clearly a pass interference. But it's okay. Won the game. And after that, he got hurt, right? And that's the excuse for the end of the year. But you also got to consider there were some very questionable decisions made on the field by him. And I don't think it's all injury. I think it's hard to say it's 100% injury. I mean, last play of the season, Trevor Lawrence missed his target either by 5 or 10 yards, or he threw it out of bounds. Which one's worse? On the 4th down play, no timeouts, you will not have the ball back. Season on the line, you know you're not making the playoffs if you don't win. That's what happened. I think, well, that doesn't mean he's a terrible quarterback. You have to consider that. And for me, while I'm relatively confident he's going to be the guy, questions loom. Questions have to be answered. And I think for this team to pay him a top-level contract, which I think they will before the year, which I don't fully agree with, I got to be near 100% confident. You got 2 years left on his rookie deal. You got the 4th, which is cheap. You got the 5th, which is that 5th-year option. You got the franchise tag. Make the right decision. That's how I feel about it, because the risk of getting it wrong, which I understand the chances are very low, right? He will probably be the franchise quarterback. I think if I had to give odds, probably 80 to 20 for me. Might even be higher. If you miss, if you get those low odds, this team is sunk for half a decade financially, because you're going to have all that guaranteed money. The contract's going to be mostly guaranteed. I would guess probably 5 years at least are guaranteed. That is a big issue if you get it wrong. And so for me, while I'm very confident in him, I want to know 100% for sure, especially because we have time, and this is going to be a big question this year. Are we going to have to make more excuses? Whether or not they're good excuses or bad excuses. I don't want to do that anymore. I want it to be clear with his play on the field, with the team around him, that he is an elite franchise quarterback and one that deserves to be paid top dollar in the NFL. That's how I feel about it. You know, it's fine if people disagree. I just think extending him right now, the reward for that is very minimal. I think it's a very small amount of money because you're already going to have to pay him second most in the league. Apparently it's $53 million a year. If you just wait and he proves you right, maybe you pay him a couple more million a year. That's not a ton more. Make him go 100% prove it on the field. That's how I feel about it. But would love to hear some opinions and some respectful opinions as well, right? Because it's a pretty heated conversation among fans. But I think there's a genuine conversation there. Now, the final thing to talk about is flipping the script. We have seen this Jaguars team have a seemingly similar projection in the past. Now, there are some things that are very different, but you go back to 2017. Jaguars had a miraculous playoff run. Looked like they were going to go to the Super Bowl. They lost to the Patriots. And there were reasons why, and the game was stupid, and calls were dumb, but they lost the game. Next year, they came back, got overconfident, and they collapsed. I think so far, that compares pretty similar to what the Jaguars have done the last couple of years. Not 100% identical, but sort of similar. I think the Jaguars got overconfident last year, and I think they lost in part because of that. I don't think they were ready. And that old team going into that next season, which given they had some big problems, some poor decisions made, like Nick Foles getting paid top dollar to come here, they ended up not having a good season after that, and things went downhill. Whether or not people agree, I do think this is a make or break season for this team. Because if you have a disappointing result, even if it's 9-8 or even 10-7 in missing the playoffs, you now get to the point where there could be questions about whether Doug Pearson should be the long-term head coach. Whether we know 100% for sure. You could be going into a fifth-year option with Trevor Lawrence where you are not 100% sold on him. There are a lot of things that could go very poorly this year, and the Jaguars team could be in a very similar situation to what the old one was, and just, quite frankly, kind of be screwed. I don't know if that will happen, but I think they have to prove this year that with a lot of people doubting them, which is usually when they're best, to be fair, that they can come together, they can answer these questions, and they can go beat the teams that are supposed to be elite, that are supposed to be perfect, like the Houston Texans, who have been unanimously decided as the division champions, and go beat them. You know, maybe go win a game in Jacksonville against them. Finish a season strong. You know, maybe be physical in the trenches. Answer some of these questions that we have. Can they do it? It's ultimately the way I would wrap this up, because I think that's the biggest question and the one that's going to define this franchise for a long time, because you could either be a consistent, deep playoff contender with an elite franchise quarterback, or you could be one that has a lot of new faces coming in because a lot of people didn't prove their worth, or just a lot of faces that are still here that have some big questions around them, and you got to have a good answer, or this team is going to be in a very bad situation. That's going to be a big question for him. I think there's a lot of ways that could pan out. I am not 100% sold on this team being great or being bad. I think there's a lot of ways it could play out. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think, maybe some of your big questions going into the season. I think there's a lot that still have to be answered, but in general, you know, looking at this roster, looking at this coaching staff, this team got better. They made some good decisions during the offseason, also made some bad ones, but generally the team got better. And I think it's a wake-up call. What happened last year? We'll just have to see if they actually wake up to that. So I appreciate y'all watching. We'll try to have more stuff out here soon, but hey, it's June. We've got 2 months until preseason really kicks off. You know, I'm not there for OTAs in Jacksonville. Not a ton to report on, but we'll continue to have summer scouting. I'll probably try to put up 1 or 2 other videos a week that are more Jaguar centric. That's the plan for this channel. If you guys got ideas for what you want as well, definitely let me know. I would appreciate it. But thanks for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.